As I said, the walks that I'm going to be talking about today are geolocated sound walks. So these are made using the application Echoes. And what it means is that what you do is you attach sound to particular locations so that when a participant moves through those locations with the application downloaded onto their smartphone, the sound files will automatically trigger. And it means they don't have to have their phone in their hand as they walk, and they have the rather lovely experience of the sound happening to them as they move through the space. So I suppose that is something that makes the experience potentially more immersive, more sensory. And there's lots of creative possibilities that Echoes offers with curating sound as well. But one of the things that we could discuss is the fact that they do have to have an application downloaded to their phone in order to access that walk. They also have to be able to download and stream the walk. So there are accessibility questions about using this application, which I think are worth discussing, and I'm happy to discuss those with you. Just briefly though, when you work with Echoes, this is the kind of interface that you will look at. It's an online map, and those kind of pale blue areas that you can see are echoes that I have made within the map. And then you can attach a number of different types of sound files to those. The blue line is the walk that people take through those echoes. And the sound files can be triggered in a number of different ways, which I'll talk about later on in the presentation. When you're working with that map interface, you can quite easily move things around and reshape the echoes. And there are different types of echoes that create different types of effects as well. Again, I'll talk a little bit more through that later on in the presentation. What I thought today would be useful would be to talk about a particular walk that I made, which might be appropriate for this audience and for your interests in 2021. This was a walk that aimed to connect participants with wild nature in the streets of central Manchester, called the Wild Nature Trail. So it guides participants through the centre of Manchester, which, if you know it, in parts is a very nature depleted place. It aims to draw their attention to wild and spontaneous growth of plants in a number of locations in the city. And these include back streets, canalways, abandoned buildings, and the culverted river Medlock, which runs under the streets of the city. And I've got a link to that walk at the end of this presentation as well. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit now about the creative processes of making these types of geolocated sound walks. My starting point will be to read around a topic while simultaneously engaging in field work. So that field work will generally be walking repeatedly in the space that I've chosen for the walk. And I think the intersection between conceptual research, where I'm identifying ideas that I want to explore, with this practical tactile experience of being in and walking through specific spaces is really beneficial and a really joyful part of the process. Finding interesting connections, but sometimes dissonances, elements in the space that don't meet or align with the ideas that I'm interested in. So for the Wild Nature Trail, my starting point were concepts of wildness. I've got a link in this presentation to an online account of the research I did that went into this walk, and there's a much more extended conceptual discussion of theories of wildness. But really, the working definitions I came to for this work were the ones you see on the screen. So looking at wildness in nature as a state of self-willed growth, of having qualities of complexity, excess, lack of restraint, this idea of autonomous spreading, irrepressible coming into being, resilience, and like a really interesting disinterest in the human that we might see within a wild natural nature state or ecological formation. Equally, the principle, I think, for this walk of seeing wild nature in cities is a really positive element of those cities, as instructive and rejuvenating and powerful, as resilient and flexible, particularly in spaces that are spaces of human neglect and disturbance, but also representing different ways of being and sustaining and interrelating, and other perspectives of time, beauty, and belonging. So these are the types of principles that I was really interested in embedding in the creative practice of the walk, and that led me as I was making the walk. So while I'm reading around these kinds of ideas and developing them, I'm also doing some location scouting within the city. And I'm thinking about what are the engaging, surprising connections there might be between the ideas and the types of processes present in these locations. So this one is a back street behind the Quakers Meeting House in Manchester, just the back wall with some really, really abundant ivy growing over it. That was a space that I took people to discuss the kind of growth of that plant. This is a abandoned building, the Hotspur Press building near Oxford Road Station in Manchester, like an urban wildscape, essentially, a space that's been abandoned by humans and where nature has taken over. But it's also a space that's marked for development, so one that may not last very long in its current state. So we talk about that and we experience that on the walk. And spaces that really are a little bit more human curated. So this is a canal basin in Manchester that's obviously been planted and cared for to some extent, but then has like overgrown its initial intentions in lots of ways. So we talk about that quality of wildness within this space that's a little bit more human focused. And also through to things like living walls on corporate buildings that have been planted, obviously in a very curated way, but which cheeky weeds and wild plants have taken over and grown in as well. So all of these spaces really are a way of exploring a kind of spectrum of wild nature in the city. And often when I'm going through the locations, it leads to more background. I have to find out a little bit more about the spaces themselves. And my walks aren't really designed to be informative. I prefer creating something more experiential, but definitely some information, some navigation are essential parts of a sound walk because they ground the other elements and allow the participant to move smoothly and confidently through the different locations that you've identified. So after this starting point, the location scouting and the conceptual explorations, it's starting to build the script and the route. So I'm starting to fix the locations for the walk while also developing the text. And the text and ideas are probably still in flux. And the locations are to some extent too, but through a play between them, the route will emerge. And I start to form what that route will be and start to assign sections of the script to particular locations. And here I think there is a mix of considerations. There's practical considerations, which are to do with the accessibility of the actual spaces themselves and the stability of those spaces. Are they going to stay the same over time as people walk through them or not? I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Also, the flow of the work in terms of how the walk manifests different ideas and experiences of space, how they connect together and how they might link to the wider experience. So this is an example of the type of notes I would take at this stage of building the walk. I'm just putting down kind of quite functional things about trees. I'm thinking about where they are, what they feel like they're there for. I'm also making connections between things like Medlock construction and the Medlock River. The script is starting to come in little bits, and I'm doing some background research, as you can see through that link there. And at the same time, I will be looking at developing the sonic palette for the walk. So the things that I work with for my walks are digital sounds, vocal sung loops, some analog instrumentation and field recordings. So as you can see for the Wild Nature Trail, I'm using pretty much all of those except for the analog instrumentation as a soundscape for the walk. So in terms of recordings, I did do some recording binaurally with a binaural field mic of water, birds, leaves, wind and trees. So binaural recording, so it feels like the sound is surrounding the person as they're wearing their headphones. I did some binaural recording of my voice as well when I was using instructions. So that's quite interesting and useful when you want somebody to turn left and the voice goes into their left ear. That can navigate them quite well. Equally, it can be a much more kind of immersive thing where you can be whispering somebody's ear and make them have a different kind of relationship with them. So I used quite a bit of binaural recording within this walk. In addition, these Logic sounds, they're from the Logic program on an Apple Mac, and it has a library of synthetic sounds essentially. And I'm just building those into little loops that I can then use within the soundscapes at various points, sometimes to link sections together thematically, sometimes to create an atmosphere. And then on top of that, as it says, there are these vocal loops that I work with. So song is a sonic tool that I use regularly within my work. In this walk, the song is often expressing the more than human elements in the space. It voices plants and creatively expresses their growth and the types of processes that are both visible and invisible in their growth in city spaces. So the vocal at the top, and I'm going to leave you to play this yourself because I don't trust that I can play sound and speak at the same time with this internet connection, but I'll explain what it is. It's basically a vocal loop song, non-verbal song that I developed to express some buddleia that were growing in railway arches above the participants as they walked through a part of Manchester. So they're walking underneath the railway arches. They are prompted to look up, and then as they look up, the sound and the song of the buddleia comes on to the within this section of the walk. So song is being used to express, and I used it for ivy, for buddleia, for various other kinds of plants within the walk as well. And that's then combined with digital sounds like the ones that I showed you, like this one, which provide a much more kind of underlying burbling soundscape. And I will use that sometimes to link sections at the beginning and ends of certain echoes, so it feels like they kind of move into each other quite seamlessly. And obviously that's also about creating atmosphere as well. So I've now got my script in place, I've got the route pretty much fixed, and I've got the sonic palette developing as well. And this is where we move to the section of the making process, which is about rough recording and positioning. So the thing that's happening here is that I'm now starting to place the text, the script, the things that I want the participant to hear into the echoes, like you saw at the beginning in the map, so that we're starting to build relationships between text, sound, and space. And within an echo on the application, what you can do is you can place one or more sound files. The sounds can be triggered in a number of different ways. So you could make it so that the sound triggers as soon as somebody echoes a location and cuts off as soon as they leave it. Or you can set it to trigger only when they enter the space and another sound has stopped playing. And what's useful about that is if you don't want any overlap in terms of your different recordings, then you can make that happen through not allowing the sound to trigger until they've heard the whole of the last one. You can make it so that the sound plays in full, whether they leave the space or not. You can create round echoes where the sound is fainter at the external part of the circle and then becomes much more intense and loud towards the middle. So there's quite a lot of creative play in terms of how you're putting the sound into the space. For me, this part of the walk is about creating different relationships between sound, location, and movement. And I think that the curation of the experience of the walk is really primary at this point of the process. So I'm thinking, for instance, in this walk about the relationships between what people are seeing, the actions or prompts I might be asking them to do to create some sensory engagement, and then obviously what they are hearing, so that there is some kinds of relationships that are forming between those things that create a certain type of holistic experience. Certain principles you might think about to do with how much time you allow people within certain spaces, how much you want to talk, how much you want them to be allowed to just experience and listen, and also the ways in which you are engaging with how the sound meets a certain type of action that you might be prompting as well. So this is a kind of space of curation, and a curation of the experience is really primary at this point. But the way that you refine that experience is really through a process of what I would call iterative testing. Now, sound walking, I think, really benefits from this stage. And essentially, what it means is that you go and put some rough recordings in the space, you position them, you go into the walk and you test it out. And then based on that, you go back into your editing, you re-record, you reposition, you go out again. So it's like a circular iterative process where you are moving constantly between the making of the sound, the recording, the going out and testing it, the remaking and the re-editing. In my experience, that is something that takes about 4 or 5 iterations at least before you will get something that's starting to form into the type of walk that you want, technically, but also, of course, in terms of the experience as well. And what I did was in the final stages of making the Wild Nature Trail, I tested with participants. So I asked them to use a test the walk for me. And then I did walking interviews with the participants, which essentially means they did the walk and then I walked the route with them. and discussed their experience, and talked about the things that worked, things that they felt and responded to, but also whether it was clear enough. And I don't think I can emphasize enough that you really need time for this stage of the process in making a sound walk, particularly one that's geolocated and relying on the triggering of the sound. And equally, it's really important to have other people test your walk before you publish it, because you will have walked it too many times at this stage to really understand how clear it is. And fresh participants coming in will help you to understand whether the walk is working the way you intended it to. Then you're pretty much ready to publish the walk and to have it online through Echoes, which I can talk about later as well, if that's helpful to people in terms of that process and what happens to it on the application. What I thought would also be helpful would be to talk through a few of the technical considerations of working with this application and some of the troubleshooting that I've had to do working with it too. So I'll start with some of the issues that I've had. Echoes offers a 3D sound option, and this means that you can place sound objects into an environment, so it feels like the sound comes from a very particular object or location. So for instance, you should be able to attach a sound to a tree in a park and make it sing, so it feels like the sound is emanating from that tree, and that your participant could move around it and feel like they're experiencing it in 360 degrees. I have unfortunately never been able to make this work. And the reason, I think, is twofold. Firstly, depending on the participant's device, how GPS is functioning, what kind of service provider they have, how much data they have, what the weather is like, whether there are buildings around, the GPS positioning will function slightly differently for every single person. And there is just a variation there that you have to be able to work with. Equally, the map that you saw at the beginning of my presentation is just not precise enough. It doesn't zoom in enough to allow you to really pinpoint the space where you might want to position a 3D sound object. So I have tried, and I have not been able to make that work because the positioning was just not precise enough. Now, that's not to say that other people have not been able to, but certainly in my experience, that was not a function that I could make happen, even though I wanted to, really did want to. It was something I wanted to work with. The other thing about varying GPS functioning is you really have to work with the echoes in different ways to ensure a seamless experience. So what I did a lot of was I would overlap my echoes. And this basically means that the echo that's coming after the one that your participant is in will automatically trigger, even if they're not quite in the right place, because they will have walked into that location, they'll be in it a little bit already, and then the sound will trigger once the last one has finished. So you get that seamless experience without having the very, very precise location triggering necessarily. You can also actually give the illusion of geolocation, interestingly, which is about how you curate the elements within a sound file or within a particular kind of sonic space. So for instance, in that back street behind the Quaker Meeting House, I get people to walk down the street. I tell them to move towards the wall, and as they're moving towards the wall, the song of the ivy starts, and they feel like it's them that's triggering it and starting it. They're not. It's just an element within a longer, larger sound file. But you can, create this kind of illusion that the sound is being triggered in that way as well, which I suppose does beg the question, why would you use a geolocation in the first place? But that's perhaps something that we can discuss. I've used echoes to create walks that are linear and chronological. My walks are designed to be experienced in a particular order following a specific route, but it absolutely does not have to be that way. You could curate an experience where people go on a kind of a sonic treasure hunt, or set them loose in a particular area to come across different sounds in a more random way. And the other thing Echoes allows you to do is to sync and layer sound rhythmically. So you could build up a musical soundscape as somebody moves through a space, which I've experienced, and it was a very lovely thing, and it worked really, really well. I find the application pretty user-friendly and stable. Participants who use it seem to have, few problems. There's a couple, but most of the time that's fine. I had a couple of bugs in my walk, some of which weren't really able to be resolved, but they were fairly minor. I think it has really exciting creative capacities. It's not perfect, and I'm a bit frustrated by the lack of precision in the GPS. but it does have a lot of things that you can play with creatively in terms of sound, triggering, location, movement. What I would say the best thing to do if you're interested in echoes is to download the app, the free app, to your phone and just see what sound walks are available in your area. Try out the ones that you can see what works well, see if you like the experience of the application as a user. And that's what I did, and it was really instructive. When I was a full-time academic, I've moved out of full-time academia now, I actually used research funding to buy what's called an extra membership of Echoes, and this did allow me access to all of the different sonic features that the platform offers. But there is a free option and an intermediate one too. And within a group, I suppose, you could do a joint purchase of one profile, and that would still mean that individuals could work on individual walks underneath that kind of single profile. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think the only other real difficulty or issue with Echoes based walks is that the audio is attached to this application. Obviously, it only works properly if you are in the location in question, and I actually think that's a good thing for some work because it creates this more specific, more curated, more locational experience, and that's really useful for climate and landscape related work. But arguably, it does make the walk less accessible, and people are sometimes less willing to download applications to their phones or are not able to do that. Then, for instance, simply having a link to a SoundCloud or getting a QR code that people can scan and linking to a hosting platform of your choice, or indeed downloading a simple sound file to a device that you can give out to people if they don't have their own devices. So, there are lots of ways in which these walks can be made. But I think Echoes is definitely good for people who are interested in sound walks as sighted, embodied, and curated experiences, and who really are interested in the creative possibilities of deploying sound in a range of different ways. Just a couple of things before I conclude. I wanted to talk about the fact that when you work with sound walks, you're working with landscapes, and that's city landscapes or rural landscapes that are moving spaces. And how do you deal with this when you have a fixed piece of media that you're creating for the future, essentially? So with my nature-based walks, I am dealing with seasonal changes to flora. I might want participants to examine a plant that grows on a wall that is only available within a certain season of the year. And actually, one of the plants that I really wanted people to look at in my wild nature trail was some abundant ivy-leaved toad flax on a wall that somebody then sprayed with weed killer, and there it was gone. So how do you deal with this? I think that one of the things that you can do is establish a relationship between the time of making the walk and that of experiencing the walk and acknowledging that difference. So you can speak to the participant from your time of making and say what you see within a particular environment, and then perhaps ask them whether that's changed by the time that they reach that space as well. So you're making that kind of temporal relationship clear within the walk. I think it can also be really interestingly for climate related stuff built into the thematics of your walk. So on the Wild Nature Trail, we visit that urban wildscape, the old building that's been taken over by pioneer plants. It's clearly been abandoned by humans temporarily, but I discuss in the walk the ways that redevelopment might change that place irreparably and obviously take away a lot of the nature that has taken control of it. And that links to the precarious and abundant presence of wild nature in cities, which is very much part of the theme of the walk. So I think you can use some of these things to your advantage if that's part of the thematics that you want to explore. When I'm making sound walks, I try to create a holistic experience. That's something that balances research and ideas, information, and creative elements. I like making experiences that flow smoothly. I'm really interested in helping or prompting people to experience locations in different ways and to pay different kinds of attention to elements. Sometimes that's forces and processes that are present, but perhaps less visible within a particular environment. So drawing attention to those. And soundwalk-wise, in terms of their creative possibilities, you can sometimes, not all the time, but occasionally create these beautiful intersections between the movement and experience that somebody can have of a physical space and then an alignment with something that's happening sonically to them, so that the sound, the movement, and the space come into this really clicky, magical, aligned and tangled formation. It's quite difficult to make that work, reliably, but I think sound walks do have that capacity. I do think they are a really good vehicle for exploring more than human connections and nature and landscapes that are changing, because they're predicated on a participant moving through a specific space unencumbered. They don't have to hold their phone in their hand. They can have some sensory engagement with the space. And at the same time, what they're listening to, the text, the sound, the song, other sonic elements, can really be in conversation with what they're seeing, smelling, and touching. And because of this, I think that sound walks can prompt a sense of discovery, of close noticing, which participants often comment on. And I think that might link to how we can connect with, value, and feel about the places we live. And my area of interest moving forward is actually about changing and damaged places, how we can connect with those kinds of places, and using sound walks to do that. Also at the bottom there, I do think there's something really special about a sound walk, in that you're usually in a public space with people doing their own things and going about their daily business, but you're having this really curated, private, personal, subjective experience while this world is happening around you. And I think that's a really special intersection that can happen within a sound walk kind of experience. So I think I'll leave it there. I hope everybody's heard me okay. I'm going to leave you with my contact details here, and these. So I've got my email address and website. I've got links to the walks and to the research that went into the 2021 walks that I made. Yeah, get in touch if you want to discuss sound walk making more, or share what you're working on, and hopefully I'll remain stable to take part in the conversation now, and to answer any questions that people have too.